She did not know what she was saving. That is the part of this story that will keep you awake at night. The terrifying, beautiful, world-altering truth that the most important decision of her life was made in 30 seconds, in the middle of a rainstorm, on an empty stomach, with mud on her boots and not a single coin left to her name. She did not calculate it. She did not weigh the consequences. She did not look up at the sky and ask the moon goddess for a sign. She simply saw something small and trembling in the dark, and she knelt down. That was her crime. That was her undoing. And that, as it turns out, was the only thing that would ever save her. But let us not begin there. Let us begin 3 hours earlier, in the great hall of the Iron Veil Pack, where a girl named Senna was being told, in front of every wolf who had ever mattered in her world, that she was nothing. The Alpha stood at the head of the stone table, broad-shouldered, golden-eyed, handsome in the way that weapons are handsome, precisely and dangerously. He did not look at her when he spoke. That was the first insult. The second was the words themselves. I, Caden Vero, Alpha of the Iron Veil Pack, reject you, Senna of the Ashford line, as my fated mate. I do not recognize the bond. I do not want the bond. And I will not be bound by the moon's poor judgment. The hall went so quiet that Senna could hear her own heartbeat. 60 wolves. 60 people who had watched her grow up, who had eaten at her father's table, who had sparred with her brothers in the yard, and not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed too loudly. They were all watching her, the way you watch something fall from a great height, already bracing for the sound of the landing. She did not make a sound. She had promised herself she would not. What none of them knew, what even she had not yet fully understood, was that somewhere out in the pouring, merciless rain beyond those stone walls, a wolf pup was dying. And that wolf pup was the reason the world was about to tip over. This is the story of Senna of the Ashford line. Rejected, disgraced, hungry, and entirely, catastrophically unaware that she was about to hand her last meal to the heir of the most powerful alpha in the known world. Stay with me. This one is going to hurt before it heals. Chapter 1. To understand how deeply the rejection cut, you need to understand what Senna had believed her whole life. She had grown up knowing. She had felt the pull toward Caden Vero since she was 15 years old. That quiet, golden thread that the moon goddess supposedly wove between fated pairs, the thread that was supposed to mean something sacred and permanent. She had never told him. She had waited, the way every pack girl was taught to wait, with patience and propriety and absolutely zero guarantee that any of it would matter. She had waited 6 years. And tonight, the night of the autumn binding, the one night per year when the moon made her choices known and fated mates could feel the bond snap fully into place, tonight was supposed to be the night it finally meant something. It meant something, all right. You don't have to perform grief, her best friend Tilda had whispered to her earlier that evening, helping her into the deep green dress that had cost 3 months of her savings. If he recognizes the bond, he'll come to you. And if he doesn't, he will, Senna had said. Not because she was naive. Because she had felt the bond herself, felt it like a second heartbeat, low and warm and absolutely insistent. I can feel it, Tilda. It's real. Tilda had said nothing, which, looking back, was its own kind of answer. The hall had been golden that evening, torches along every wall, long tables draped in wolf-gray linen, the smell of roasted boar and pine smoke thick in the rafters. The Iron Veil Pack knew how to celebrate, and the autumn binding was their finest night. Every unmated wolf above the age of 17 had gathered, dressed in their best, hearts loud with hope or nerves or both. Senna had stood near the far end of the hall, close to the hearth, trying to look as though she was not tracking Caden's every movement through the crowd. He had noticed her. She had been sure of it. The way his golden gaze had swept the room and snagged on her, Just for a moment, the slight tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible stillness. She had read it as recognition. She had read it as the bond. She had been reading the wrong language entirely. He crossed the hall toward her. And the crowd parted for him because the crowd always parted for Caden Varro the way water parts for stone, not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could smell the cold night air still clinging to his jacket, close enough that the bond hummed like a struck bell. She thought he was going to say her name. "We should do this properly," he said instead. His voice was even, bureaucratic almost, in the hall, before the pack. She had not understood then what he meant by properly. She understood now. In the great hall, with 60 wolves watching, Caden Varro stood at the head of the stone table, and he rejected her. Formally, completely, with the specific, practiced language of a man who had decided this before he'd even looked at her face tonight, and had simply been waiting for the correct ceremonial moment to say it out loud. "I do not recognize the bond. I do not want the bond. And I will not be bound by the moon's poor judgment." Poor judgment. As though she was a mistake. As though the moon goddess had simply miscalculated, and Caden Varro, gracious, reasonable, fair-minded Caden Varro, was here to correct the error. The physical pain of a formal rejection was something no one really warned you about. It was not like heartbreak, which was dull and wide and slow. It was surgical. It was a thing being removed from you. That warm golden thread, that second heartbeat, yanked out at the root, and your whole body understanding in real time that something was gone now that was never coming back. Senna's knees nearly buckled. She did not let them. She looked at Caden Varro, at his careful, handsome, unmoved face, and she said, in a voice so steady that she would never entirely forgive herself for it, "Understood. I accept your rejection, Alpha Varro. May the moon guide your path." And then she turned, and she walked out of the hall, and she kept walking until she was through the iron gates and into the rain, and only when the gates had clanged shut behind her and the torchlight was far enough away did she let herself stop walking and simply stand there, in the dark and the downpour, and try to remember how to breathe. The rain was cold. Her green dress, the one that had cost 3 months of savings, was already soaked through. She had no cloak. She had left in too much of a hurry to think about cloaks. She had also, she realized, left without her dinner. Which was funny, actually. In a bleak, rain-soaked, the universe is laughing at you kind of way. She had been so nervous before the binding ceremony that she had barely eaten all day. She had 1 bread roll in the pocket of her dress, saved from breakfast, wrapped in cloth, slightly squashed, and she had been planning to eat it on the walk home. She pulled it out now, unwrapped it, and stared at it. She was going to eat this bread roll, she decided. She was going to eat it and walk home and sleep, and in the morning she would begin the practical, unglamorous work of surviving the fact that the alpha of her pack had just publicly declared her unwanted. She was raising it to her mouth when she heard the sound. It was small, wet, and deeply, pitifully miserable. It was coming from the ditch beside the road. Chapter 2. She almost did not look. She was tired and wet, and her chest felt like it had been hollowed out with a spoon, and she truly, genuinely, did not have the emotional reserves to deal with whatever was making that sound. But she was Senna of the Ashford line, and the Ashford line had a catastrophic and well-documented history of looking. He was wedged into the bottom of the ditch beneath the roots of an old oak, small and dark and soaked through, for plastered flat against his ribs, which she could count from 3 feet away. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. He was, at a generous estimate, perhaps 4 or 5 weeks old. He was wolf-shifted, a pup, fully in his animal form, which meant he was too young and too weakened to shift back. She crouched at the edge of the ditch. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey, look at me." Nothing. She climbed into the ditch, which was not dignified, and which did very unfortunate things to the remaining cleanliness of her green dress, and she laid the back of her hand against his muzzle. Cold. He was dangerously cold. She looked at the bread roll in her other hand. She looked at the pup. She ate approximately one bite, because she was not a saint. She was a hungry and heartbroken girl in a ditch, and she had earned that one bite. And then she broke the rest of the roll into small pieces and held them out flat on her palm, right under the pup's nose. It took a long moment. Then, slowly, one dark eye opened. The eye was silver. Not amber, not yellow, not any of the warm wolf colors she was used to. Silver, like moonlight on water, or the edge of a blade just before it catches the light. She had never seen a wolf with silver eyes before. She filed that fact away for later and focused on the more immediate problem, which was coaxing a half-frozen pup to eat breadcrumbs from the palm of a girl who was herself rapidly approaching hypothermia. It worked eventually. Slowly, then hungrily, the pup ate every crumb she offered. Then he lifted his heavy head and looked at her, really looked at her, with those impossible silver eyes, and made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a question. "I don't know either," she told him. "I have no idea what I'm doing." She took off her jacket. Soaked as it was still warmer than nothing, and wrapped it around him. Then she picked him up, which he tolerated with an expression of profound offended dignity, and she climbed out of the ditch. She could not take him into the Iron Vale Pack grounds. Not tonight. Not after what had just happened. And she could not very well leave him here. So she started walking toward the edge of the pack's territory, toward the small gamekeeper's cottage her father had used before he died. Empty now, belonging to no one in particular, structurally questionable, but dry. Mostly dry. The pup fell asleep against her chest before she'd made it 200 yards. He was warm, she noticed. Getting warmer, actually. A wolf's metabolism was extraordinary, even a pup's, and the food had helped. She kept walking. What she did not see, because it was dark and raining and she was not looking behind her, was the shadow that had been watching from the edge of the tree line since she'd pulled the pup out of the ditch. It was very large, that shadow. It stood absolutely still. And its eyes, when the distant lightning briefly illuminated them, were gold. She walked on, oblivious, talking quietly to the sleeping pup about nothing in particular. The rain, the state of her dress, her somewhat complicated feelings about the autumn binding, whether or not she was going to have to find a new pack, whether bread was actually a nutritionally appropriate thing to feed a wolf pup, and what exactly she had been thinking. The shadow followed, at a distance, silently, with an expression that, had she been able to see it in a human face, she might have identified as something between astonishment and the specific dawning horror of a man who has just realized he has made a catastrophic mistake. Chapter 3. The gamekeeper's cottage was exactly as she had remembered it. Small, cold, and smelling strongly of old wood and mouse ambitions. The roof held. The fireplace worked, once she convinced it to, with the dry tinder stacked beside the grate and the flint she kept in her boot, a habit her father had drilled into her so thoroughly that she did it without thinking. She laid the pup on the hearthrug. He stirred slightly, made a disgruntled sound, and went back to sleep, which she took as a sign that he was fine. She wrung out her hair. She hung her ruined dress near the fire. She found an old wool blanket in the chest under the window and wrapped it around herself. She sat down on the floor next to the pup. "Right," she said to him, quietly. "What are we going to do about you?" He didn't answer. He was a pup and also asleep. "You can't go back out there tonight," she continued. "And I can't go back to the pack grounds. So we're going to have to be uncomfortable together, which honestly, I have a lot of experience with, so that's fine." She stayed awake for a long time, watching the fire and listening to the rain and thinking about Caden Vero and his golden eyes and his flat, precise voice saying poor judgment. She thought about the 60 wolves who had watched and said nothing. She thought about Tilda, who had known and hadn't warned her, and had been right not to, because what would a warning have done? She thought about the pup's silver eyes. She fell asleep somewhere after midnight, curled against the hearthrug with the pup warm and solid against her side. She was woken at dawn by the sound of a fist against the cottage door. Not a knock. A fist. The kind of impact that does not ask permission. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, which was an Ashford instinct, and she had a fireplace poker in her hand before she remembered that she was in her father's cottage and not actually in danger of anything except possible frostbite and social humiliation. She opened the door. There were 4 of them. Large men, wolves, unmistakably, with the particular kind of coiled stillness that came from years of training, dressed in dark riding clothes with a crest on the breast pocket that she did not immediately recognize. Behind them, 2 horses. And behind the horses, Caden Vero was not there. She registered that first, with a relief that embarrassed her. What was there was an older man on horseback, watching her with dark, evaluating eyes. Gray at his temples, jaw like a cliff face. The kind of man who had not had to raise his voice in a very long time, because things tended to do what he wanted before he asked twice. "Is the child with you?" he said. Senna blinked. What child?" "Small. Dark fur. Silver eyes." He said it the way you describe a lost item, brisk and specific. "He was reported missing from a traveling escort last night. We've been searching since before midnight." She looked down at the hearthrug. The pup was sitting up, watching the door with those uncanny silver eyes. His ears were forward. His tail was up. He looked considerably more imperious and considerably less pathetic than he had last night. She looked back at the man on horseback. "He was in a ditch," she said. "He was hypothermic. I fed him the last of my food and brought him in out of the rain." She kept her voice level. Factual. She had gotten very good, in the last 12 hours, at keeping her voice level. "He's fine." Clearly. The man on horseback looked at her for a long moment. Then he dismounted, which seemed like a significant gesture, though she wasn't sure why. "What is your name?" he said. "Senna." "Senna of the Ashford line. Ironvale Pack." She paused. "Formerly." Something moved behind his dark eyes. "Formerly. I received a formal rejection last night. I'll be leaving the territory by week's end." She said it the way you report weather. "Cold front coming. Low chance of survival. Pack your things." "Is the pup well enough to travel?" "He ate a bit, but—" "Who rejected you?" She almost didn't answer. It was not this man's business. But there was something in his stillness that reminded her of her father, the particular gravity of a man who asked questions because he already knew the answers and was checking to see if you'd lie. "Alpha Caden Vero," she said. "At the autumn binding. Last night." The silence that followed was very, very loud. One of the 4 guards shifted his weight. Another one found something interesting to look at in the middle distance. The horses, to their credit, were unbothered. The man looked at the pup. The pup looked back at him. Then the man looked at Senna, and she saw in his face something she had never expected to see from a stranger, the specific, controlled fury of someone who has just understood the full scope of something terrible. "You gave your last meal," he said slowly, "to a freezing pup in a ditch, on the same night you were publicly rejected and left your pack grounds with nothing. In the rain." She shifted the poker in her hand, which she was still holding. "He was going to die." "Yes," the man said. He went down on one knee. Not in the dirt. The ground was still wet from the rain, and his riding clothes were expensive, but on the cottage step, which was stone. One knee. In front of her, "I am Edric Thorne, first warden to the High King of the Greywood Packs," he said, in a voice that had gone very formal and very quiet at once. "And this," he glanced at the pup, who yawned, utterly unmoved by the drama of the moment, "is Prince Leaf, third son of High King Erevan Thorne, my king's heir, my king's blood." Senna looked at the pup. The pup licked his own nose. "Oh," she said. "The High King has been searching through the night. 3 search parties. The escort horses were spooked by lightning and scattered. Leaf ran. We lost him in the dark." He paused. "You found him." "He found me, actually. Or, we found each other." He was making sounds. She stopped. She was rambling. She took a breath. "He's all right. He just needed warmth and food." Edric Thorne, first warden to the High King, looked up at her from one knee and said, with the weight of a man delivering a verdict, "The High King will want to thank you personally. Will you come?" Chapter 4. She should have said no. She was wearing a wrinkled dress she'd slept in. Her hair had dried overnight into something that could only be described as an architectural decision. She had exactly nothing to recommend her to the court of a High King. She said yes. Not because she was brave or ambitious or had any particular plan forming in her head. She said yes because she had nothing left to lose, which was, she was beginning to understand, the most dangerous state a person could be in. It made you reckless in the best possible way. The Greywood Court was 2 hours north by horseback, through the deep forest that the Ironvale Pack had always treated as a kind of vague, enormous neighbor, large, important, and best left to its own affairs. She rode behind one of the guards. The pup, Leaf, rode in front of her, wedged between her and the guard's back, tucked under her arm like a very small and royal parcel. He had shifted back to his human form somewhere around the first hour, which had involved a brief, disorienting moment of Senna suddenly holding a small, dark-haired, silver-eyed boy of perhaps 3 years old who looked up at her with great solemnity and said, in a voice much too dignified for a 3-year-old, "You smell like pine." "You smell like wet dog," she told him. "We're even." He had considered this for a moment, apparently found it acceptable, and gone to sleep against her shoulder. Edric Thorne, riding beside her, had made a sound that she strongly suspected was a suppressed laugh. The Greywood Court was not what she had expected. She had expected stone and severity. She had expected the visual language of power, banners, guards, the cold architecture of a place that wanted you to know, immediately and beyond all doubt, that you were small. What she found was oak trees woven into the walls themselves, their branches part of the structure, the whole court alive in a way that Ironvale's stone halls had never been. The main gate was flanked by wolves, not guards, actual wolves, enormous and still as statues, and watching her with amber eyes as she rode through. The High King was waiting in the courtyard. He was not, as she had vaguely imagined, old. He was perhaps 40, with the same dark hair as the boy she was still holding, and the same silver eyes, and a quality of attention that reminded her, inexplicably, of a storm that has decided to be polite. Leaf woke when the horses stopped. He looked at his father. He raised one small hand. "Papa." Something moved in the High King's face, vast and fast and quickly controlled, the way water moves just before the surface stills. He crossed the courtyard in 4 strides and lifted the boy out of Senna's arms, and for a moment he simply held him, this powerful, composed, silver-eyed king, and pressed his face against his son's hair and breathed. Senna looked at her own hands, because it felt like something private. "She fed me," the boy said, muffled against his father's shoulder. "She gave me all her bread, even though she only had 1 piece." The High King raised his head. He looked at Senna. She looked back, with a very specific expression of a woman who has been awake for 20 hours, eaten approximately 1 bite of bread in the last day, is wearing a wrinkled dress, and is being assessed by the most powerful man in the known Pack territories. He is overstating it, she said. I ate a bite first. 1 bite, the High King said. It was my bread, she said, with considerably more dignity than the situation warranted. I was entitled to a bite. The High King looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was not loud but was the sort of voice that tended to become the only voice in whatever room it entered. Edric tells me you were rejected last night by the Alpha of Ironvale. Yes. And left the Pack grounds alone, in the rain, with 1 bread roll. He says it like it was a plan, she said to Edric, who was standing very still behind her. It was not a plan. It was a terrible evening. Edric made the suppressed laugh sound again. The High King did something she had not expected. He smiled. Not a political smile. Not the kind of expression you wear when you want someone to feel comfortable. An actual, brief, unguarded smile, as though she had surprised him into it. You are welcome in my court, Senna of the Ashford line, he said. For as long as you wish to remain. I don't want charity, she said immediately, because apparently 20 sleepless hours had removed her remaining filter entirely. I'll work. I know tracking, basic medicine, 3 languages, and I can outshoot most of your guards at 200 yards. Silence. 200 yards, the High King repeated. 240, on a good day. The smile came back. Slower this time. More settled. Well, he said. I suppose we should find you some breakfast first. Then we can discuss the archery. Behind her, she heard Leaf, still held against his father's shoulder, small and content and apparently entirely unbothered by having nearly died in a ditch, say, with great confidence, I want her to stay. The High King looked at his son, then back at Senna. It appears, he said, that the matter is settled. Chapter 5. She stayed. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself it was practical. She had nowhere else to go, and the Greywood court offered her work and shelter, and the kind of uncomplicated respect that she had not, she realized, ever been offered before. She told herself it was about Leaf, who followed her through the oak-woven halls with the single-minded devotion of a small prince who had decided she was his. She did not tell herself it was about the High King. Not for a long time. His name was Aravan. He told her that himself on the 3rd day, when she called him Your Highness for the 4th time, and he stopped walking and said, with a patience that suggested this was a thing he felt strongly about, My late wife called me Your Highness once. Once. On the day we met. After that, she called me Aravan and made it quite clear that she would continue to do so regardless of what the formality guide said. I found it extremely refreshing. A pause. My point is that you may call me Aravan. She had looked at him. And if I find the title more comfortable, then I will find you a better title. Your Magnificence, she suggested. I was thinking perhaps something with fewer syllables. She had laughed. Genuinely. For the first time in 3 days. It had surprised her so much that she'd covered her mouth, as though catching the sound, and he'd watched her with those silver eyes and said nothing, which was the particular nothing of someone who was paying attention. She noticed and set it aside, and went back to teaching Leaf how to track by scent in the lower courtyard. The thing about the bond was that she had not expected to feel it again. She had thought, in that efficient survivalist way she had adopted since the rejection, that the Caden Vero thread had been the whole of it. That the moon had made her choice and been refused, and that was simply that, and Senna would carry on living without a mate bond and be fine. People were fine without mate bonds. She knew several of them. They were perfectly functional humans who had simply opted out of the cosmic lottery and gone about their lives with an admirable lack of drama. She was going to be one of those people. Except, Except that on the 14th day, she was in the High King's library, which was not really a library so much as a room that had lost control of the book situation several centuries ago, and she was reading a tracking manual and he was reading correspondence and neither of them was talking, and she was warm and fed and Leaf was asleep upstairs, and she looked up and found him looking at her. Not quickly. Not with any attempt at pretending he had been doing something else. Just looking. With those silver eyes, and the storm is being polite quality, and something underneath that she recognized the way you recognize a song you haven't heard since childhood. She put down her book very carefully. "How long?" she said, in a voice she was proud of for staying steady. "Has this been?" "The night Edric brought you in," he said. No hesitation. No apology in it, but no pretense either. "You were standing in my courtyard in a wrinkled dress holding my son, and telling me you'd eaten a bite of the bread first. I felt it then." She stopped. "That's the least romantic sentence I've ever heard. You had been awake for 20 hours and you still negotiated for your right to one bite of bread." "I found it," he paused, choosing the word with care. "Extraordinary." She looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was made of woven oak and was, objectively, beautiful. "I was rejected 2 weeks ago," she said. "I am aware of what faded bond grief looks like. I am aware that people who have recently been through it are not. They're not in the right state to." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking anything from you. I'm not." He set down his correspondence with the deliberate care of a man putting down something that requires both hands. "I am simply telling you the truth. You asked how long. That is the honest answer." She looked at him. "The moon," she said, "has absolutely terrible timing." "In my experience," he replied, with exactly the dry weight of someone who had been a king long enough to have opinions about cosmic forces, "she has very good timing and absolutely no regard for convenience." Senna pressed her hand flat against the page of her open book and felt, under the old familiar ache of the rejection scar, something that was warm and silver and entirely new. It did not feel like the Caden Vero thread that had been golden and heady, and she had waited 6 years for it, pressed flowers hoping it would bloom. This felt like the fire in her father's cottage hearth, the one she'd lit herself, in the dark and the cold, with her own hands and her own flint. Something she had made possible. Something that would not go out. She was not ready. She told him so, plainly and without apology. He said, with the absolute unbothered patience of a man who had waited out longer things than this, "I know. I'll be here." 3 months later, a formal envoy arrived at the Greywood court from the Ironvale Pack. Senna was in the Eastern Yard teaching the palace guard about technique that she had recently and delightedly discovered. None of them knew when Edric appeared at the yard's edge with the particular expression that meant someone else's bad decision had become his problem. "Alpha Vero's representative is requesting an audience," he said. "Regarding," the briefest pause, "a matter of bond reconsideration." The practice range went very quiet. Senna lowered her bow. "Bond reconsideration," she repeated. "Apparently," Edric said, with the neutral tone of a man who had strong feelings that he was professionally required to keep to himself, "the Alpha had a change of heart. Upon reflection." She thought about the 6 years she had spent waiting. The green dress. The 60 wolves who had watched. Poor judgment. She thought about one bite of bread in the rain. She thought about a small boy with silver eyes saying "I want her to stay," and a king who kept his word quietly and without performance, who had been there every day since and asked for nothing in return. "Tell the representative," she said, picking her bow back up and setting her stance, "that the bond was formally accepted, and then refused, and that the moon, as it turns out, had excellent judgment all along." She released. 240 yards. Dead center. Edric made the suppressed laugh sound. Later that evening, Erevan found her in the library again. She was reading. Leaf was asleep against her side, one small fist curled in the fabric of her sleeve. He sat down across from her without saying anything. She looked up. "He sent an envoy," she said. "I heard. I sent him away." "I know." She looked at him. This silver-eyed, careful, patient man who had knelt in his own courtyard and offered her breakfast before he offered her anything else. Who had given her work and room and honest truth and the 3-year-old shadow of a son, and had waited like a man who knew some things were worth being slow about. "I am still," she said, with the precise diction of someone saying a very important thing for the first time, "not entirely sure what I want." "That's all right," he said. "But I think," she looked down at Leaf, then back up, "I think I would like to find out. Here." The silver eyes were warm. Quietly, deeply warm. "Here," he agreed. And the fire in the hearth burned on, steady and unhurried, the way all good things do. She gave her last meal to a starving wolf pup in the rain. She did not know what she was saving. She did not know that the thread the moon had cut with a cold-eyed alpha would be rewoven somewhere in a library full of books and firelight and a small boy who smelled like pine. She did not know that her worst night would become the first page of her best story. She only knew she was hungry and heartbroken, and that something small needed her. So she knelt down, and the world, quietly, magnificently, changed. If this story moved you, if Senna found her way into your chest the way she found her way into mine, leave a comment below and tell me what hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needed a story where the right person wins in the end. I will see you in the next one.